In 4.3, a theory is unveiled to us. Aha stole Ouroboros' primer Molie in the form of aftertaste, as savouring something's aftertaste is also an act of elation, thus resulting in Ouroboros' fall. We go on to learn that the primal desires of life have always been entangled. So, the concepts that define elation and veracity are intertwined, but what are those concepts? What lies behind the elation's curtain? And what has veracity got to do with it? Before we continue, I'll warn you that going forward I will draw on Amphorius' law to inform our understanding of the eons and their paths. Amphorius is a microcosmic simulation of the rest of the universe. Elation is confirmed to be embodied by Zagreus in the Pillar of Trickery. For veracity, there is no explicitly confirmed representation. However, I believe there is heavy implication that they are reflected alongside the nihility in Fegusa the Ocean. If you wish to understand why that is, I would encourage you to watch the first part of my video, Veracity on Plan Arcadia. Otherwise, I will simply leave you with the fact that Fegusa's name derives from the ancient Greek word meaning to eat. In the first Myriad Celestia trailer, we were introduced to Aha the Elation with the word hedonism. Hedonism derives from the ancient Greek for pleasure, and is oft, though not singularly, associated with positive sensory experiences. That is to say, positive experiences involving tasting, touching, feeling, etc. Think of the act of drinking or eating something enjoyable. Given that Aha stole the concept of aftertaste, it would be safe to assume these ideas are close to the heart of elation. Indeed, in my video Veracity on Plan Arcadia, I argue that it is these very ideas that are at the heart of the veracity. Where veracity is concerned, however, I think we can also suggest that they embody something a little more bestial, primal, or base. You would be forgiven then for thinking hedonism is only concerned with pleasure, but that wouldn't be accurate. Philosophical thinking on hedonism focuses just as much on pain as it does pleasure. For hedonists, they exist dualistically. Jeremy Bentham, likely the most well-known propositioner of hedonism, famously said, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." I would suggest it has been made clear that Aha's elation, or indeed Aha themselves, exhibits a similar dichotomy. For example, in the Astral Express databank, it is stated that elation and sadness are two sides of the same coin, and that the eon of elation can also perceive power in the beauty of tragedy. Or about Zagreus. The true Zagreus is often depicted as a two-faced god, who is both smiling and crying. Its two parts are much like the coexistence of lies and truth in the world. One cannot exist without the other. It is this very same duality that seems to be reflected in the Elation's two factions, the Masked Fools and the Mourning Actors. Factions that were once one singular entity. These factions, by right of their names if nothing else, also indicate to us that the theatre, specifically the dramatic genres of comedy and tragedy, has also had a heavy influence on the writer's depiction of Aha's elation, and that is where we will start. The word comedy is generally understood today to have derived from the ancient Greek words meaning revel and singing. Though in his Poetics Aristotle speaks of the claim that the comedians got their name from wandering village to village, being excluded from the city. Indeed, while formal dramatic comedy originated in Athens in the 5th century BCE, the komos, a ritualistic drunken procession, is thought to be an important source of comedy. Furthermore, comedy had a specific place in civic festivals that worshipped the god Dionysus and the rebirth of spring. The Athenians specifically held a festival known as City Dionysia, which included dramatic competitions on separate occasions of both tragedy and comedy. Suffice to say that the intersection of sensory pleasures, drunkenness and hedonism, with comedy began long ago. As such, I can't help but wonder if this relationship is reflected in the one between Aha's elation and Ouroboros' veracity, a reflection of the development of comedy from something informal in drunken revelry to something a little more formal in dramatic poetry. Don't forget that Fegusa on Amphorius is emphatically associated with drunkenness and revelry. Bacchus, for example, tells us that intoxication is the closest one can get to experiencing Fegusa. But the association of the so-called base with comedy does not stop there. Such associations will serve as a hallmark of comedy and laughter, becoming intrinsic to the genre itself. Indeed, those associations also become a hallmark of critique against comedy and laughter for many, many years to come. This goes especially for the church. As you might imagine, if comedy and laughter represent the basely earthly pleasures, then it represents something the church has historically taught against. As a result, comedy continued into the medieval period to thrive in places such as festivals, marketplaces, and taverns. Mikhail Bakhtin stated on this, laughter made its unofficial but almost legal nest under the shelter of every feast. Once more, it is easy to draw correlations between this historical development of comedy and elation and veracity. As I've already said, veracity is synonymous with sensory pleasures, but clearly especially the act of eating or tasting. It is also here we can look at the morning actors, whose criticism of elation is an echo of real-world fears surrounding comedy and laughter, particularly those deriving from the church. The morning actors advocate for abstinence and penance to dilute the temptation of elation. There is a suggestion, then, that elation represents some sort of vice or corruption. In likeness, Baudelaire stated in a critique of comedy, "From the standpoint of my Christian philosopher, the laughter of his lips is a sign of as great a state of corruption as the tears in his eyes." All in all, it seems that elation overlaps with the pleasures of Rabelais' more bestial veracity, in a way that may reflect real-life development of laughter in comedy, from the essential nature of comedy to the fears of it too, all being represented rather dualistically in Elation's two factions. As we have established, comedy is associated with the base and primal, taking home in marketplaces and taverns. It might come as no surprise then that comedy has historically been associated with a lower social class. For example, in Plautus's Amphitryon, where we get the first appearance of the word tragicomedy, Mercury says, "I will make it a mixture, let it be a tragicomedy." I don't think it would be appropriate to make it consistently a comedy when there are kings and gods in it. What do you think? Since the slave also has a part in the play, I'll make it a tragicomedy. The idea presented is plain. Tragedy is the realm of gods, kings, and the states, and comedy of the lower. It is perhaps for this reason that the most famous dramatic archetypes associated with comedy are those often inhabited by characters of a lower social class. It is seemingly these archetypes, and indeed the idea that comedy is representative of a lower social class in general, that seems to have inspired the masked fools. It was said of Amphora's Zagreus that they do not have their own temples or altars, as even Zagreus' disciples would not worship such a god. Thus they have become a god of the poor and unremarkable. The character archetypes I speak of are of course those of the fool and the tricky servant. I would personally argue these archetypes have a great deal of overlap, and at the very minimum stand adjacent to one another. With that being said, let's start with the tricky servant. The tricky servant, or tricky slave as it was in ancient Rome, began with Plautus's Pseudolus. The archetype involves a servant or slave who is clever and witty, despite often being depicted as foolish. Sometimes they are the only source of wisdom. They can also serve as a bridge between the audience and the stage, communicating truths about the plot and its characters. They might even speak directly to the audience. The tricky servant also schemes behind the scenes to help resolve their lord and lady's problems, often one involving marriage and love. The maid Dorine in Moliere's Tartuffe, for example, schemes to help the young Marianne marry her fiancé Valère, instead of the religious con artist Tartuffe her father demands she marry. Dorine does this while delivering funny, clever insight into not only Tartuffe, but the rest of the family. For example, Dorine says about Tartuffe to Orgon, the father, "Yes, so he always says he's full of vanity," which doesn't quite fit in with all that piety. A man who leads a godly life and has real worth should try not to show off about his noble birth, and true humility and true devotion don't go so well with arrogant ambition. Dorine, like many tricky servants, and indeed fools, is heads and shoulders above most of her fellow characters in terms of wisdom. Indeed, Marianne, at the very minimum, would be lost without her, as she runs verbal rings around Orgon, the deceived patriarch of the family. This is an archetype we see echoed in all our playable masked fools. Sparkle, for example, takes on this role during Penacony's storyline. She works under contract with the Stellaron Hunters to move the plot along behind the scenes, often communicating truths and hypocrisies about the various characters, if in a sometimes slightly callous way. I think there is also an argument that this idea is seen within the characters of Aventurine and Cythera as well. Cypher schemed to use her power to make lies reality to keep the Dawn device on, but does so entirely in secret. Moreover, many of our playable masked fools, or those associated with Elation in a fool-like way, are depicted to be of a lower social class. Sparkle is an actor, Sampo a merchant, and for characters like Silverwolf, Cypher and Aventurine, being in some way maligned by society is incredibly important to who they are as characters. Cypher, for example, grew up thieving to support herself. In fact, in relation to her deception with the 300 rogues, she said, "Next, it's time for every tyrant, parasite, and slaver in all of Emphorius to witness the power of the so-called wretches they despise." The archetype of the fool is all the things we just talked about, except there is less emphasis on them being loyal to a master. They are often a bit more of an individual force. The other thing about the fool is that the fool is an archetype that transcends theatre. Socrates, for example, has often been likened to a fool, at least in the way Plato presents him. The fool is also argued to be found in certain mythologies or religious traditions. I have personally found this idea to be especially prevalent in esoteric circles. Famous esotericist Alistair Crowley, creator of the Thoth tarot deck alongside the illustrator Lady Frida Harris, posited this idea, giving examples such as the god Dionysus and Zagreus. He also says, rather interestingly for us, to treat the two gods as one. He also refers to the Green Man, Mercury, etc. It is in these figures Crowley wishes to emphasise the idea of the simultaneous existence of great wisdom and great innocence, along with the ideas of rebirth and beginnings. Remember at the beginning I mentioned that it was festivals surrounding spring that were the source of comedy? It is exactly that idea. This is why the Fool trump card has the number 0, why it sits beginning of the trumps, as Crowley puts it. The Fool is a negative issuing into manifestation. The universe, or the world, the last of the trumps as it is in other tarot decks, is that manifestation. Its purpose accomplished, ready to return. Again, thinking back to our associations of comedy and the base, the Fool represents the earthly or material. In other words, despite the archetype being seen in many godly figures, there is something quite human about the Fool, and something quite spiritual too. It is perhaps for that reason some also liken Jesus Christ to a sort of fool-like figure. It reminds me of Zagreus, who takes on a flawed material form in Bartolos, or even Aha themselves, who among the eons possibly seems the most human of all. Aha even famously disguised themselves as a human to infiltrate the Astral Express. Suffice to say, in my opinion, these archetypes have deeply informed the masked fools, those associated, and Aha themselves. Throughout this video, we've already touched on the dualistic nature of Elation quite a bit. It must be said that it is emphatically pointed out to us within the text. Tears hit the ground, turning into droplets. Zagreus, the master of deception, the coin of whimsy, embodies duality, just like the body and its shadow, a smile with tears. But this act will have a specific focus on the dualistic relationship between lies and truth, or fiction and reality, much like the source of Cypher's power. It will surely come as no shock that these themes are incredibly important to Elation. Sparkle uses frequent disguises, Sampo is one of clever deceptions, and Planacadia is deeply concerned about the nature of identity. Simply put, Planacadia asks the question, are we what we pretend to be? That is a question that has both dogged the hills of comedy and theatre and become integral to it too. To prove what I mean, let us go back to ancient Greece for a moment. Plato, in the Republic, distinguishes between two types of performing dramatic poetry. The first is a third-person narration of events, and the other is where one makes himself like the characters speaking, thus hiding themselves. This is where the idea of mimesis is born, and to make a long story very short, it refers to the idea that acting a part will lead one to actually take on the characteristics and behaviours of that role. As you might imagine, a result of this idea is that Plato was particularly concerned about those acting, in his opinion, baser roles, or roles with flaws. As we have already established, it is those roles that underpin comedy. But truthfully, they underpin tragedy as well. In any case, it's here we see the first budding fears about the nature of fiction and its relationship with reality. Later on during the Renaissance, as acting became more naturalised, there was a great deal of change in scientific and cultural progression. Consequently, in comedy, there was a reflection on the nature of truth. Does art and theatre reflect truth, or make it? This became a central motif of Renaissance comedy, the ideal versus reality, imagining a self divided between what one was and what one might become. As such, Plautus's comedy Menachme became the model for a number of twin-related plots. With twins, it seemed a character could be in two places at once, which of course is intended for laughter, but also provokes questions about the perception of time and space, and even the possibility of achieving a unified identity. This should sound familiar to you, as it is this kind of idea we see reflected in every playable character on Plan Arcadia thus far, the relationship between them and their masks. But it is perhaps more literal in the case of Sparkle and Sparksy, where the question of who is the mask and who isn't is paradoxical, or more recently with Himiko, who, at least if we believe Asat Pramad, created a version of her ideal self in the form of an imagine. The relationship between these characters and their masks, between reality and fiction, is not meant to be so simple as one is real and one is fake, but rather something more complicated. Indeed, if we take a more focused look at the genre of comedy itself, we find that the theme of mistaken identity is incredibly common. In fact, I would argue you would have a harder time finding a comedy without some sort of mistaken identity than with it. This mistaken identity can come in many forms. I've already touched on one example with the con man Tartuffe, who lies about being a man of the cloth. You can find many in Shakespeare's various plays, both intentional and unintentional. Maybe a famous example being the Masquerade Ball in Much Ado About Nothing. Another interesting example would be Bernard Shaw's 1914 Pygmalion, where the bloody, insufferable phonetics professor Henry Higgins makes a bet that he could turn flower girl Eliza Doolittle into a duchess by changing her speech, clothes and behaviour. Again, at the risk of being repetitive, I want to emphasise there is a deep exploration of the nature between fiction and reality in all of these cases. For example, in the original production of Tartuffe, Tartuffe was an actual member of the clergy and was merely a hypocrite rather than an imposter, though that wasn't well received and thus was later revised. In Pygmalion, there is an exploration of the ridiculousness of the British class system, of what makes one, especially women, working class or higher class, how much of it lies within surface level perception and treatment rather than anything more essential. But no play can get across my point better than Oscar Wilde's 1895 The Importance of Being Earnest, where two men, Jack and Algernon, fall in love with two women obsessed with the name Ernest.
It had always been a girlish dream of mine to love someone whose name was Ernest.
And thus pretend that they are Ernest. However, at the end of the play, Jack, an orphan, finds out that his real name, the name that he was christened with, was actually Ernest all along. So, Ernest was actually being Ernest because Ernest was Ernest all along. Or in other words, what was a lie and what was true overlap. This is the idea that underpins the identities of not just the masked fools and those associated, but the characters of Plan Arcadia as well. This is what Yao Guang meant when she said to Evanesia that she's not terrified of her fog's mask, but rather that Evanesia is her mask, and what she's truly afraid of is her true self. It is Sparkle and Sparksy, Yao Guang and the Slaughtering General, Asheville and La Mancha, Silver Wolf and Zero, Blade and Yingxing, Pramad and Rizuki, Himiko and Himiko. Are we who we pretend to be? That is the question. On Amphorius, it is said that Zagreus is tolerated because nothing is perfect and no truth remains eternal. Change and carelessness can be fatal, but they can also be a saviour in a critical moment. Much the same is said of Aha. No one can predict what this eon might express their mirth at. Joy is a right of sentient beings, and Aha inspires their believers to delight in the joys of life. They take pleasure in the sharp turns of fate. In comedy, there is the assertion of will and individuality, that one's actions can change their situation, often for the better. At the end of Pygmalion, for example, Eliza asserts her humanity, her will formerly being lost in being Higgins' experimental doll, and leaves Higgins behind. The philosopher Schopenhauer suggests this assertion of will, however, leaves one in a state of disappointed longing, unlike tragedy, in his view the highest of the poetic arts, which allows us to have a peaceful recognition of our will-lessness. In other words, he is saying that tragedy allows us to view and accept our own harsh reality, whereas comedy only offers false hope. It's a very similar idea to one supposedly purported by the mourning actors. Agony makes people mature, but fleeting joy only offers hopeless and unreachable temptation. All beings should renounce joy and endure grief to temper the spirits. In comedy, there's incongruity. To quote, "We laugh when we realise the terrible truth by which firmly cherished expectations are shown to be delusive." It reminds me of Asap Pramad, who firmly establishes the idea that Trailblaze is destined for destruction, for an end. His own disappointed longing becomes evident. When he was icy, he experienced Ackerville's disappearance. He said that Ackerville yearned to transcend the universe's end, to venture beyond the paths, but vanished from sight, leaving nothing behind but a small speck of light. He comes to the conclusion that the path is just a dead end, a sick joke. Don't forget, in talking about destiny and dead ends, Pramad's power also seems to revolve around probability, which is rather interesting as Polka Kakamond has a very similar power to control probability and uses it against Aha within the simulated universe in her knowable domain. In the mission Antonomic Waltz, Polka actually flat out says, in the knowable domain, probability and coincidences bear no meaning. You will welcome a play of comedy, and then one of tragedy. Indeed, Aha does show up and sends Polka's perfectly crafted clock, the determined universe, into utter chaos. Aha says, "Take a look at this place. Everything is locked in its path, and it's eerily silent." Honestly, the stars should all burst into laughter, because whether it's the false universe or the real one, they're both just poorly executed jokes. Essentially, Aha creates such a level of instability and chaos in the system that one cannot know the future anymore, therefore achieving free will, as if the future is perfectly known, one's choices become insignificant. It is exactly the kind of free will characteristic of comedy, just like within the previously mentioned Pygmalion. Aha declares the universe is like a madman's jest, chaotic, irrational, and beyond comprehension. The knowable domain will henceforth be known as the unknowable domain. In a way, both Herta and Polka end up being correct at the end of Antonomic Waltz, hence the mission's name. But nevertheless, this relationship between freedom and comedy, and tragedy and fate, is made quite clear. I would imagine it will be one further explored on Plan Arcadia. Thank you so much for watching. Before I close out the video, I just wanted to touch on 3 short points. The first point is simply that this video is limited in its scope. It does not cover all the possible inspiration for Elation's creation. If it did, we would be here all day. But I especially want to highlight that this video takes solely from the Western tradition, and so is not representative of different thinking you might find around the globe, which is especially relevant for Hoyo, who are not only based in China, but source their inspiration from a fair few places. The second thing I wanted to touch on is Plan Arcadia, and presumably Astropolis. Plan Arcadia, in terms of pleasure or hedonism, seems to focus particularly on how art and aesthetics are approached in a post-modern day, with distinct references to manga, TV, and so on. This is likely, in part, a none too subtle meta-commentary on how people approach Hoyo and their games in the real world, essentially how we consume media today. The third and final thought I had to voice is that in the Mists of Amphorius, Zagreus actually stole Fagusa's chalice. I presume this is a reflection of the theft of Ouroboros' aftertaste. It does put a lot of the stories, and to be honest, a lot of Amphorius, in a new light for me, perhaps especially the story of Zagreus disguising themselves as Nestia, and thus being inducted into the Pantheon. Maybe it's made more interesting by the place art and aesthetics has in Plan Arcadia's storyline. Nevertheless, it's worth keeping the stories of Zagreus in mind going forward in the story. Thanks so much again for watching, and see you next time.